and preserve York's setting and special character will be protected by ensuring that inappropriate development is not permitted in the Green Belt. I fundamentally believe that York Local Plan is sound, and this is because it achieves a balance that is right for our city. The preparation of this plan has taken an enormous amount of work from a professional and dedicated team of council officers, many of whom live in the city and care about the city's future, and I would like to thank the team for their efforts. Finally, the council is keen to adopt the local plan and begin to implement policies that will benefit the city and achieve our aspirations to build more homes, create a sustainable city, foster new communities, and ensure the special character of York remains established for many years to come. We therefore welcome the examination in public and look forward to the constructive discussions ahead to assist the inspectors.
Thank you, sir. So these opening remarks will go on the examination page in due course, as will the couple of cases it refers to. One of the exceptions to the site-specific issue you raised earlier, of course, will be Stransell Common and the DIO objection, which is a legal compliance issue. So a local plan for the City of York has, it's fair to say, been some time in coming. York has not had its own local plan since the Borough Development Plan in 1956, as you'll be aware. But we don't, in these submissions, seek to explain what has been until recently a history of incomplete progress in plan making. Some of that material is set out in the plan itself, but we focus instead, as you will expect, on the matters that are now before you in these examination hearings and comment briefly on them by outlining their context as an introduction to the following sessions. The City of York authority area covers about 105 square miles, 27,200 hectares, I'm told. It's characterised by a compact urban area surrounded by what has been described as a clock face of small settlements. The compact form is a key feature of a city which is almost unique in this country with its easily recognisable medieval street pattern, 2,000 years of unbroken urban development, and one of the highest concentrations of designated heritage assets in the country, including, of course, one of the grandest of Northern Europe's Gothic cathedrals, and has the only set of complete medieval city walls in the country. Arterial routes and accompanying development strike outwards from the historic core. The city's rural hinterland and green space, including its strays and river corridors and inns, penetrate into the heart of the urban area, strongly influencing its built form and character. Those open corridors are vital in defining the setting of the city and in maintaining its historic character and environmental quality. Of the 27,200 hectares of land in the council's area, about 4,500 of those hectares is built up, with the remainder being open countryside, the majority of which is green belt. Land outside the built-up areas of York was identified in green belt proposals which remained in draft or the sketch plan form from the late 50s until the Yorkshire and Humber Plan Regional Spatial Strategy to 2026, published in 2008, which contained a key diagram you'll be familiar with, which set out the general extent of the green belt around the city, included a requirement for detailed inner boundaries of the green belt to be defined in order to establish long-term development limits that safeguard the special character and setting of the historic city. Policy also required the City of York Local Development Framework define the detailed boundaries for the outstanding sections of the outer boundary of the green belt, about 6 miles from the city centre, and the inner boundary. It didn't seek, as you wouldn't expect it, to impose a high degree of precision on those matters. When the regional planning tier was abolished with the 2011 Act, the Regional Strategy for Yorkshire and Humber, Partial Revocation Order 2013, retained these policies, which also required that plans for the York area should protect and enhance the nationally significant historical and environmental character of York, including its historic setting, views of the Minster and important open areas. These factors have, we say, rightly guided the strategy in the plan. And will you forgive me sneezing and blowing my nose since I managed to come down with a heavy cold yesterday. I do apologise. York has a robust, modern and mixed economy. It continues to attract inward investment to major development opportunities within the city. Its historic attractions are the cornerstone for a thriving visitor economy. It's a centre of excellence for higher and further education, including 2 universities, and its institutions are both major employers in their own right, as well as supplying a skilled pool of labour to serve the science, technology and professional service industries in the city. Technical work on economic growth has been carried out for the Council by Oxford Economics, which suggests that around 650 jobs per year would be created in the city during the planned period. With this ambition for the city comes a key challenge of providing enough housing across the planned period to meet identified needs, balanced against the need to preserve the historic environment and the green spaces that make the city unique, as well as the protection of the surrounding green belt. The OAN figures will be the subject of debate, of course, in due course tomorrow, but it's clear from the proposed modifications based on the GL Hearn Housing Needs Update that the Council relies upon the more recent household projection figures, the 2016-based ones, and the mid-year estimates from 2017, which reduced the proposed OAN figure. These figures, we say, can't realistically be ignored when applying the relevant practice guidance on assessing what the OAN for housing should be, given that the plan is advanced under, as you've already made clear, the transitional provisions and the 2012 NPPF. The guidance advises that wherever possible, local needs assessment should be informed by the latest available information. That is what GL Hearn and the Council has done. This approach hasn't been changed by government when applying the transitional arrangements to plan making, and it's difficult to see, in fact, how the Council could have escaped criticism if it had disregarded the more recent figures. The wider approach of government to the assessment of housing need has been and remains in a state of flux, but for plans being prepared under the transitional provisions, the Council considers it was justified in amending its proposed OAN in response to a clear change in circumstances. From this demographic starting point and taking into account different approaches for household formation rates, GL Hearn concluded there's an economic-led need for housing of up to 790 dwellings per annum. The Housing Needs Update assessed the housing need associated with the planned economic growth of 650 jobs per annum. The OE forecast on which that figure was based was tested against forecasts from the Regional Economic Metrics Model. That forecast a higher level of job growth, as you'll have seen, the fundamental difference being that it anticipated greater expansion of social care and health jobs to meet a growing population, whereas the OE model anticipated a more consistent size for public service jobs, with the majority of growth in healthcare offset by a decline in wider public sector jobs and no growth within the education sector. The Council will present an update to the OE work shortly, which supports lower job growth over the remainder of the planned period, but we say that wouldn't constitute a material change, and it underlines the robustness of the 650 jobs per annum figure that we're currently advancing. The latest OE report suggests it may be something of the order of 610, but we see that as being a small degree of change which doesn't justify an overall reduction, but just an indication of robustness. For reasons that will be better explained in due course, GL Hearn and the Council considered the OE figures to be robust and noted for the sectors that affected land allocation through the Employment Land Review, the REM figures were slightly lower than the OE forecast. There would then be sufficient headroom in the original projections and land allocations to meet the identified growth in the newer forecasts. For housing need purposes, the growth of 650 jobs per annum was therefore considered to remain realistic. This was translated into the 790 DPA figure with an appropriate allowance for part return to trend to transpose population figures into households. Beyond this figure of 790, GL Hearn and the Council have considered market signals. An uplift of 15% in the demographic starting point, which is 484 dwellings per annum, would allow for this, recognising that house prices are relatively high in York and that affordability has worsened over the last 5 years. This would still fall some way short of the economics-led OAN of 790 dwellings per annum. As for affordable housing, the SHMA had previously identified an affordable housing need of 573 dwellings per annum, but it's not considered feasible to provide for all of this need. If such an uplift was applied in York, then the OAN would be unrealistically high, having regard to the view that the figure of 790 dwellings per annum based on economic-led needs was already substantially higher than the figure based on demographic projections. While some uplift to the demographic-based need figures may be considered to improve affordable housing, it was concluded that this did not need to be done in a mechanical way whereby the affordable housing need on its own drives the OAN. It was also necessary to bear in mind that affordable housing need includes some households who are in unsuitable accommodation, and if their needs are met, their home is released for occupation by others, which would not result in a need for a net additional household. The housing requirement also takes into account previous unmet need, described as an inherited shortfall from between 2012 to 2017, which brings the requirement for housing to 822. On the supply side, despite the reduction in the OAN, the Council decided to maintain the supply in the submission draft of the plan, with the exception of the allocation at Queen Elizabeth Barracks. that it now proposes for deletion on habitats grounds. As with the change to the OAN and housing requirement, that proposed change places the Council in the position of contending that the plan it submitted should be modified, and you've mentioned that issue already, sir. However, again, there's good reason for the change in approach, which largely reflects the request of Natural England as the statutory nature conservation body for visitor studies to assess the potential effect of the allocations on Strensall Common SAC. Those studies contradicted the expectations of the submitted HRA and showed much higher visitor numbers than had previously been assumed, and they have prompted a change in position, supported by Natural England, whereby the Council is no longer satisfied that mitigation would remove reasonable doubts about development causing adverse effects on the SAC. This has been confirmed in an updated HRA and sustainability appraisal. The contrary position of the DIO will no doubt be ventilated, but the Council is not convinced by its evidence given the strict legal requirements of appropriate assessment. And of course, you have to be satisfied beyond reasonable scientific doubt that there will be no adverse effects on the integrity of the SAC. All of the proposed houses would be within 400 metres of the SAC, which underlines our concerns. In the case of measures to mitigate harm, even at the appropriate assessment stage, there must be certainty, and unimplemented future measures may present a problem. Indeed, it's been said that the appropriate assessment of the implications of a plan or project for the sites concerned is not to take into account the future benefits of such measures if those benefits are uncertain, inter alia because the procedures needed to accomplish them have not been carried out, or because the level of scientific knowledge doesn't allow them to be identified or quantified with certainty. I should add that it may be necessary in due course to review a number of the other sites to ensure that an appropriate assessment is, if an appropriate assessment is required, that it is undertaken, because there are a number of other sites that potentially impact on the SAC, and it may be necessary post people over wind to ensure that appropriate assessments are undertaken so that you have more than screening assessments. This issue aside, the decision to maintain levels of housing supply allows for an appropriate level of flexibility in order to deal with unforeseen circumstances over the duration of the planned period and to enable a supply of sites that will create a greenbelt boundary to endure beyond the planned period, which of course is 2033. This approach is warranted given the supply includes a number of large strategic sites, and it's entirely sensible, we say, to anticipate a degree of slippage, as well as an element of needing to future-proof the plan given the reality of evolving governmental approach to assessing housing needs outside the transitional provisions. This is consistent with NPPF policy on local plan meeting objectively assessed needs with sufficient flexibility to adapt to rapid change. A similar strategy, as you'll be aware, was adopted in the Guildford local plan, where the examining inspector, Mr. Ball, also found that such considerations were relevant to the exceptional circumstances required for greenbelt release. And Sir Duncan Ouseley has recently dismissed the challenge to the plan, and he's given some helpful remarks on the issues of the greenbelt and the robust, taking a robust approach. And we've added that decision to the examination library. We will return to these issues, of course, in detail at the individual hearings. The work carried out by the Council has contributed not only to the setting of detailed boundaries as anticipated by the old RSS policy and the NPPF, but to the justification of releasing land from the Green Belt. The topic paper addendum summarises the exceptional circumstances which are relied upon by the Council to justify these releases, which will be explained further in the hearings. The Council has examined, we say, all reasonable options for meeting its identified needs for development and concludes it wouldn't be possible to do so without releasing land from the Green Belt. This process has taken into account a spatial strategy which seeks to achieve a sustainable pattern of development that recognises what I mentioned earlier, namely the historic character of the city and its setting, including the open land which brings the countryside into the city and the established smaller settlements in the surrounding area. Other important influences on this strategy include areas to be protected for their nature conservation value, which I've mentioned one already, green corridors and open space, the flat geography of the city, which exposes significant areas to flooding, and the favouring of areas where access by sustainable transport exists or can be readily achieved through new development. Whilst it's accepted that the release of sites will plainly affect the openness of the Green Belt, the selected sites are considered to be the most suitable and sustainable approach to meeting development needs, having regard to the spatial strategy and causing as little harm as possible to the Green Belt. This wider strategy results in a focus on new development in the main urban area, whilst allowing for urban extensions to existing built-up areas, as well as the 3 new strategic garden village sites, which reinforce the clock face of settlements around the historic city and maintain the essentially open land which runs towards it. This is a sensitive, we say, and balanced strategy which meets the need for new development whilst recognising the constraints affecting the city, including its green belt and the historic character that it is primarily designed to protect. This strategy has widespread support from Historic England, amongst others. Having said those matters, I'll turn briefly now to consider the duty to cooperate and other matters of legal compliance. On the duty to cooperate, sirs, it's a matter for you to decide whether it is reasonable to conclude the authorities have complied with their duty under Section 33A in respect of the plan's preparation. In the language of the legislation, we were required to engage constructively, actively, and on an ongoing basis in the preparation of the plan with other authorities and a variety of prescribed bodies to maximise the effectiveness of plan preparation with regard to strategic matters, namely the sustainable development or use of land that has or would have a significant impact on at least 2 planning areas. Details of how we have met this duty are set out in the statement to demonstrate compliance with the duty to cooperate in 2018 and our response to MIQ on matter 1. And no doubt you'll be asking questions about that in due course. The statement explains how the City of York falls within 2 sub-regions, the Leeds City region, which is a LEP area, and the North Yorkshire and York sub-region, comprising the City of York itself, the County of North Yorkshire, and the districts or boroughs within it. The Council is also a member of the York, North Yorkshire and East Riding LEP. The planning areas potentially affected by strategic matters were considered to comprise the local authority areas of Rydale, Selby, Harrogate, Hambleton, and the East Riding. Wider strategic issues were also recognised at the LEP level. Prescribed bodies of particular relevance to the plan included Historic England, Natural England and the Environment Agency. The authorities and bodies used the duty to cooperate matrices to identify strategic matters for subsequent discussion. These produced a list of strategic matters including the scale of housing and employment growth, retail growth, leisure, transport, waste and minerals, gypsies, travellers and show people, social infrastructure, the natural and historic environment, green belt and air quality. The statement identifies how particular strategic issues were also identified from collaborative work on the previous draft course strategy, as well as comments on each stage of plan preparation, including the preferred options stage from 2013. This has taken the form of regular officer meetings, the making of representations as appropriate to other authorities on their local plan documents, as well as consistent technical discussions at regional and sub-regional officer groups. The Council has been responsive to discussions and suggestions which have been taken into account and have often influenced the content of the plan. The outcomes of this work are set out in Section 4 of the statement and summarised in MIQ response on this issue. The Leeds City Region Planning Portfolios Board and the North Yorkshire and York Spatial Planning and Transport Board resolved in 2017 and 18 to endorse the approach taken by the Council on their discharge of the duty to cooperate. Statements of common ground with the neighbouring authorities, Historic England, Natural England, the Environment Agency and Highways England have been provided. These confirm what was said in the addendum to the statement to demonstrate compliance with the duty. There remains no outstanding issues with the other authorities or bodies regarding the discharge of that duty by the Council. Overall, therefore, we say it's clear the Council has engaged constructively, actively and on an ongoing basis in the preparation of the plan and that the duty to cooperate has therefore been met. Although our submissions don't go through the detail of every aspect of the work, it's worth briefly addressing at this stage the approach that was taken to the housing market area and meeting housing needs. In recognition of practice guidance which specifies authorities should assess their development needs working with other authorities, the Council recognised its potential links with neighbouring authorities. Prior to the commissioning of the 2016 SHMA, discussions took place between York and neighbouring authorities to explore whether a joint SHMA commission should be produced. Whilst York, Rydale, Hambleton and North York Moors National Park Authority agreed to commission a joint study, it became clear that both Selby and Harrogate District Councils had both recently commissioned their own SHMA updates. Selby in particular had recently completed a SHMA in June 2015 to inform their anticipated allocations DPD, and that following the adoption of their core strategy in 2013, which had already set out a housing requirement equating to the provision of 450 dwellings per annum. To ensure a consistent approach, the remaining authorities commissioned GL Hearn to produce a SHMA for their areas. The methodology and approach for this study were aligned with those already undertaken for Selby and Harrogate to ensure consistency in data sources and assumptions. The 2016 SHMA and the SHMA update in 2017 for York concluded that whilst there were links between the commissioning authorities, they did not converge into a single HMA. GL Hearn considered, having regard to the overall evidence of linkages, that only Selby and York should be considered a distinct HMA, and the travel to work analysis indicated very high levels of self-containment in York. Council and Selby District Council therefore worked together, recognising the reality of the timing of the Selby core strategy and the SHMA work. By agreeing with Selby, this has allowed the Council to identify the need to be addressed in the remaining part of the HMA. This demonstrates, we say, compliance with the duty and meets policy objectives by ensuring that the overall needs of the HMA have been met. Turning briefly to other legal requirements, the plan complies, we say, with the wider requirements of the 2004 Act and the 2012 regulations. Further details are set out in our local plan legal compliance checklist. It's been prepared in accordance with the Council's legal development scheme. Consultation was carried out in accordance with the statements of community involvement and the statutory requirements. Sustainability appraisal has been carried out and updated, and we say is adequate. The plan includes policies which are designed to contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. The Habitats Regulations assessment carried out for the submission of the draft plan was revised at the proposed modification stage and informed the change of position on the allocations at Queen Elizabeth Barracks. And so, subject to the point I've made about needing to review whether appropriate assessments are required for the other sites potentially impacting on the SAC, we say the HRA is legally compliant. In particular, the judgments as to whether mitigation proposed to address recreational impacts on the SAC have been reached lawfully and are justified has been considered. The Council prefers the supporting view of Natural England, and this should be given, we say, substantial weight to the position taken by the MOD. The defining of greenbelt boundaries ensures the plan is in general conformity with the RSS. We have briefly touched on some of the issues, therefore, that will be raised, but don't rehearse them any further in detail. We'll rely on the evidence that you've been referred to and contained in the responses to your MIQs. It's considered that the plan has been positively prepared. It's plainly a positive strategy, justified, based on the substantial evidence base that has emerged over several years. It's effective and it's deliverable over the planned period, and we say it's consistent with national policy. As you mentioned, we have suggested a number of modifications in order to make the plan sound, and of course we will be open to further suggestions and your advice in due course as to any further modifications that are necessary, and indeed whether the ones that we've proposed are appropriate. However, of course, as you've already said, modifications must be to remedy deficiencies in the policies and to make the plan sound, not simply to improve proposals which are on a proper analysis sound. So we commend the plan to this examination, and we welcome the opportunity to deal with your questions and any of the issues arising. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Elvin. Let us then, without any further ado, turn to matter 1, the legal requirements.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me as well? Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive opening statement, Mr. Elvin. We are now going to look at matter 1, legal requirements, and the discussion will be focused on the questions that we've set in the matters and issues and questions document already circulated, as my colleague Inspector has already said. The first section of this will deal with the duty to cooperate. At this point, I was going to ask the Council to give a sort of brief run-through of the method of the strategic considerations and how they were identified and how the strategy addresses those, really just to sort of set the scene. You may have touched on some of that, obviously, in the opening statement that you had on. Yes, so that's been very helpful. Thank you. And so, really, it's just sort of digging a little bit deeper on that now, really, in terms of the duty to cooperate and those sorts of things. I wanted to sort of get an understanding, really, of particularly the relationship with the local authorities that has been discussed, and the workings on what those strategic cross-boundary issues, how they were derived and agreed, basically, at this stage. If you start with that.
Mr. Slater, to my right, is going to deal with questions both on the duty to cooperate and then in due course with community involvement.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Slater.
So, morning, Mike Slater, Council's Chief Planning Officer. Well, reference to the documentation that you have, sir, and parties here will have had sight of. The authority has a long and good working relationship with its neighbouring authorities. Those are detailed in the documentation. In addition to those immediate local authorities, then, as has already been mentioned briefly, the authority has a relationship with the wider group of local authorities that are the York, North Yorkshire, East Riding, and more recently including Hull local authorities. And that's basically to the north and to the east of the city. And then to the west of the city, a relationship with Leeds City Region. Again, some of those authorities are our immediate neighbours, others obviously extend through to the former metropolitan districts. So those are catalogued in the documents in terms of that long-established working relationship, both at officer level and at elected member levels. Both of the two larger organisations have elected member groups. They have changed their names over the years, but we have a spatial planning and transport board for York, North Yorkshire, and the East Riding that's well established. And for Leeds City Region, we had, until recently, it was known as the Planning Portfolio Holders Board. It's recently been merged with Housing and Economic Development and has become known as the Place Panel. So those are both elected member groups that consider development plan proposals and other planning and related issues across the geography, really, of the sub-region. And obviously, as part of those groups, the immediately adjoining neighbouring authorities are represented there. We've submitted in evidence a statement of common ground that's signed by our immediate neighbours. I think one thing is possibly worth pointing out at this stage is that Selby, one of our closest neighbours, has recently changed its approach in terms of plan preparation and is embarking from a resolution in September to progress a new local plan. In terms of that, they have, and we have confirmed, that it is their intention that their aspirations for growth would be accommodated within their district, and there is no ask or suggestion in that from either officers or from members that would have an impact on York's local plan.
Just to add to that, what they've done is they've abandoned their site allocations DPD and they're going to a full local plan review.
Was that decision in September?
September, yes.
Thank you. Clearly that's at a very early stage, then there's no indication of any further timescales on that then at this stage?
No, we're waiting for that information. It is quite...
We haven't had issues and options yet, have we?
Colleagues are just looking at the LDS documents that they've produced.
Issues and options 2020.
So, yeah, so we have potentially their outline for the LDS is 2020, Reg 18, issues and options, Reg 19, 2021, submission 2022, adoption 2023. So they're at the start of a long journey. So
we'll put the LDS into the examination library.
I don't know if it's going to be relevant, but is there a particular reason why Selby's abandoned the site allocations DPD and gone for a full new local plan instead?
colleagues will be able to assist here, but I think it's the issue in terms of assessment of housing needs and housing numbers within the district. I'm going to see if colleagues behind me can give me more detail.
Is that to say that under the standard method they arrive at a smaller figure? That's
correct, yeah. Their housing number changes and they felt it's appropriate to move forward with a new local plan.
Thank you. So in terms of how that change in circumstances has occurred, what is your position in terms of how that affects, you've touched on it slightly in terms of housing requirement, but in terms of your attitude to the plan as you see it going forward in terms of housing figures?